All right, everyone, welcome to this episode of Table Space. For those that aren't familiar with this, Table Space is a podcast interviewing as many people as possible, just talking about role playing games and sharing our passions for the hobby, how they impact our lives, and how we use that to help impact the people for the other people for the better. So I have a very special guest today, Grim Jim. Thank you so much, Jim, for agreeing to meet with me. Despite the fact that we live on other sides of the world, definitely appreciate your time, and really looking forward to spending the next 30 minutes an hour just to talk to you, get to know you, and get to hear your side of the story and your passions for role playing games.
Sounds great. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you just great on my end. So, kind of a warm up question: do you read novels at all?
Yeah, not as much as I used to. I had a big project a few years back where I had to read an entire series of novels, and that kind of wore me out for a bit.
Sure.
But yeah, I do still read.
Any books in particular, or fantasy, or I mean, any genre in particular you prefer reading?
I tend to prefer science fiction and horror as my go-tos.
Any recommendations you have? Be sure to take some notes and take a look.
um, I haven't read anything that's really excited me in quite a long time. So going back a bit, I'd say Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash is really good. China Mayville's Baslag series is really good. On the comic side, I've been rereading The Invisibles. Grant Morrison's entire corpus of work is pretty good. Warren Ellis as well, Alan Moore, obviously. And also on the comic side, I've been enjoying Goblin Slayer as well.
Awesome. So, kind of going into the theme of this show, how did you get into role playing games?
So, um, I'm British, obviously, and I think things have been a bit different on this side of the pond for the ways in which lots of people have got into role playing. I mean, D&D is still like the big way into the hobby for a lot of people. Obviously, being the big one, but here in the UK, less so, perhaps. And for me, my path into gaming was via fighting fantasy books. Me and a friend both collected them, and without really knowing what we were doing, we were kind of playing them like role playing games. So, like, I would read out the descriptive text, and they would decide what to do as the character. And that's really how I got my start. And then they put out an orange covered book, which was how to play it actually as a role playing game. And then in the back of that, they talked about some of these other games. On the back of that, I went to a model shop in a nearby town and ended up walking out with Middle Earth role playing, the old Iron Crown Enterprises version. And yeah, that was it. I was away to the races.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And another question I have for you. This is something that I've been asking every guest that I've had. It's in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. There's a foreword written by Mike Carr. And he talks about the question is dungeon mastering or game mastering, whatever you want to call it. Is it an art or a science? And I'm just curious, in your opinion, do you have an idea? Is it an art? Is it a science? Both? Neither? Something else?
I've been having an argument for about a decade on the same question, but about stage lighting.
Mm.
Uh, we can't agree, and I don't think you'd get full agreement there. Um, it's both in a way that probably the same way that stage lighting is. If I were to give in to the other side, because you need to understand the physics of how it works in order to get the artistic side to work the same way. Like, it's useful to know color theory when painting, or grammar when writing a book. or or having a good knowledge of vocabulary when writing a book. So I think it's both, but it's more on the art side than the science side.
Cool. And as far as role playing games for you, do you have a particular favorite? I think if I remember right from some of the videos I've watched, D&D isn't necessarily like your go to.
No, I mean I had a few years when I was playing role playing games and I'd never even touched D&D, which I think is actually a good thing in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people get kind of trapped in the sort of cul-de-sac of D&D in the same way that a lot of miniatures wargamers get kind of trapped in Warhammer and never experience anything else. So my formative experiences were more things like fighting fantasy, Middle Earth role playing, Dragon Warriors, which is a classic game that was put out here in the UK in paperback format, which was very good. Dave Morris and some other people put that together. So I guess those and Warhammer kind of set the tone. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay for the kind of games that I prefer, the kind of darker side. I like fantasy more in my games than I do in the other media that I consume. So, but those would be the formative ones for me.
Okay.
Otherwise, I don't really play favorites.
Sure.
I'm game agnostic.
Cool. Yeah, that's something that I'm trying to be. D&D definitely is kind of like, I guess, like you said, at the forefront. There's a lot of my friends are interested in playing it, but part of the reason I started this show is just to try to interview as many different people as possible and see what everyone else has going on, in their backyard as far as like role playing games. And you said earlier when you talked about the novels, you had mentioned you like to read like sci-fi and horror. Do you run a lot horror role playing games as well, or is that something you prefer to have just in books or movies?
I have run a lot, and I got a license of an old obscure horror RPG called Blood, which I made a second edition for. That's quite sort of splatterpunk, and I'll often bring in unsettling or horror elements to any other game that I run. Really, it's a big challenge. I think the two hardest moods to pull off at the table are comedy and horror. So I relish the challenge of genuinely unsettling people or making people laugh.
Yeah, and so this role playing, I've never heard of it actually. I'm gonna look into it. You said it's called Blood.
Yes,
Okay,
the original edition was by Norley Tucker. I think he only ever did one one game.
sure. I'll check it out for sure. And do you find that particular systems help with either comedy or horror or any other kind of, I guess, emotion you're trying to portray in the role playing games that you play?
Yeah, I'm a proponent that system matters. I really do think that a good games master can create a good game and a good theme or mood or whatever with any system, but it's better when the system and the setting are in synergy and they help you create that. So I think on the comedy side, to shift gears slightly, I think Paranoia is probably the most successful comedy RPG of all time. And in part, I think that's because it is quite formulaic. You have the steps you go through, you kind of anticipate the jokes coming, the experimental equipment that never works properly, how every other player around the table is watching you constantly to see if you're a traitor or not. These elements just make the whole thing absurd and makes it work. More spontaneous comedy is more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think I agree with you there on that. Um, so changing gears a little bit, I kind of looked a little bit over your website. Is it postmortem.com?
There's Postmortem Studios is the company name. It's post-mort.com
Okay.
is my sales site.
So when did you get started in like designing, I guess, your own content?
Professionally or or on an amateur basis?
Yeah, I guess we could start with your amateur basis, and then if you want to dive into professional, whatever you
Well, I
comfortable with.
was, yeah, I was like 7 or 8 years old when I started role playing through the fighting fantasy books. I was probably 9 when I got that first fighting fantasy orange book with the were tiger on the front, and I was making my own adventures pretty much straight away, building on the example dungeon that they had in there. And then once I got MERP, so I would have been, I guess, 10 or 11, I was constantly making up my own adventures and things for that, though I don't think we understood the rules properly at the time. So I've always been making my own stuff. I wrote I wrote a game for a friend based on Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future, and he paid me £12 for it. Now I think that was my first professional gig, if
Nice.
you can call it that. And then I kind of did some fan stuff. I did some photocopied fanzines for a while. I did a newsletter for a play-by-post game. That's snail mail, kids, not email. For a while, and then getting out of school and so on, looking for work. Just basically spammed every role-playing game company we could find an email address for. Me and my writing partner at the time, and it was Steve Jackson Games that gave us that first opportunity. That would have been 98, 99, and that was the Munchkin's Guide to Power Gaming, which was the first, full-on proper professional thing that we did, that I did, and that won the Origins Award in 2000. So not bad for a first go.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you so I know you've been around the block for a while. I'm 31. I was born in the 90s, and being that you're across the pond, as you had put it. What was or was there even like the satanic panic of the 80s here in America with D&D and things like that?
So there was, but it wasn't quite as bad. There were issues, there were problems, but on a smaller scale. Despite having an official state religion, Anglicanism, I would say that the UK is overall, culturally at least, much more secular than the United States. Religion is something private; you keep it to yourself. You don't make a big song and dance about it. But even so, there were issues. Kids whose parents were maybe a bit religious or who had been spooked, who wouldn't let their kids play, burnt their books, threw their heavy metal albums out, all of that kind of thing. There was often trouble role-playing game clubs finding places to play, because a lot of like village halls and so on where you might form a club were run by the local church. Scout huts and things. The scouts are an ostensibly religious organisation, so they would prevent people from using their spaces. I think the worst thing that I think I ever had happen directly to me, there were worse things that happened to others, but we had an evangelical group called the Good News Club, I think, come into our secondary school and do a video presentation and so on. They kind of ambushed our teacher with this. He didn't really know what was going on. Where they presented this video called Doorways to Danger, which I think you could find on YouTube, but it's going on about how rock music is evil and the occult and Dungeons and Dragons and all these other things, and that was a bit of an affront. But yeah, plenty of people had it bad over here, but never quite as bad as the States.
Got you. Thank you for sharing. And I have another question. Have you played, or were you involved with Vampire the Masquerade at all when that had come out?
Yeah, I went to a big game store in a nearby-ish town called Aldershot. And the game store there is actually still is one of the main distributors of role playing games in the UK, and they had literally got Vampire in that day, that morning. So I bought it the day it came out in the UK,
Wow.
and we played it that evening. And yeah, I was heavy into that. We ended up joining the LARP Society, mostly because my tabletop game had swollen to over 30 people and it was just unmanageable. So we kind of made the switch to LARP and ended up joining the official society, and I was in that from about 95 through 2005 when I quit.
Nice. So I don't know if you've ever watched. There's a documentary. I think it's called World of Darkness. It's been a few years since I watched it, and one of the things they talked about is how when Vampire came out, it kind of changed I guess, the scene of tabletop role playing. Did you experience that? Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's as abrupt a change as some people would say. It was the culmination of a trend that had been building up for some time. I mean, even in Dungeons and Dragons, you had a shift in emphasis from combat and dungeons to intrigue and more focus on the roleplay. That mostly came from Dragonlance, so that kind of movement happened from there. Then you had various games. We wouldn't call them story games today, but they were steps on that sort of path. I don't think you could have had Vampire if you hadn't already had Cyberpunk, which put quite a lot of emphasis on setting the scene, setting the mood, what music you'd have on the background, whether you put your leather jacket on when you're playing, that sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't seem like much, but it was all a step along the way. And then Vampire, with its change of vocabulary and its ambition for games to be more artistic, to reach for being something more, even if the execution wasn't necessarily there. I think the idea and the ambition was quite transformative.
Interesting. I know. I feel like I'm very new to Vampire. I just know a little bit about it, but I feel like I don't know if maybe you can attest to this. It's definitely more popular in Europe than it is here in terms of like the LARP scene and that sort of thing.
I mean, the US always dominated the LARP scene when I was more involved with it, but it was quite strange. Different countries had a very different feel to their games. I visited the States for a couple of the big conventions that we had for the Vampire LARP Society, and for a while I was running the game in London, and so we quite often had visitors from abroad coming over and playing, and just game culture can be very different in different countries. I don't know whether that's still the case. I mean, the internet has probably blunted that a bit since I was doing it, but it used to be that there was a very different culture. I don't want to stereotype, but the Germans were very much about playing by the rules, but played a bit more fast and loose with the lore and background, whereas the French were very heavily into the lore and background and making sure the characters fit, and that you didn't colour outside the lines too much, but they were more fast and loose with the rules. Here in the UK, because most of the LARP venues were pubs, it was quite tied up with drinking culture, and people would often go out clubbing and so on afterwards. So that gave it a very different feel to the States, where drinking was banned during the LARP games. So it's weird. It's different in different places.
And you, as a game master, and having played a variety and staying system agnostic, what is your particular style of running games?
I prefer to have an improvisational style, so I like games that aren't too crunchy, aren't too prep heavy. Some of that goes away with familiarity as you learn the system and so on. But I like to think of my feet and introduce random elements and just kind of go with the flow. Read the table, read the players, and see where that takes us.
Yeah, yeah, I can relate to that. I definitely more of an improvisational style myself. Do you have a particular memory that's kind of a fond this memory of this hobby, or is it more of like a too many to count for you?
Too many to count.
That's
I
that's
think.
that's fair. And what about, have you ever had this moment where these games or these LARPs, these experiences impacted you on a deeper, more personal level?
I met my partner through the LARP Society. That was the case for a lot of people, actually. Um, Playing in the world of the Lord of the Rings from the start, I always felt a connection to Tolkien's work. I mean, I basically live in the Shire. It's all thatched cottages and woodland and things, and that gave me a deeper connection to that. I think, which I haven't felt with anything else. But I think that's a testament to his world building as much as anything else. Realizing I could make some sort of a living doing this was good. But it's like with the moments in role playing, it's hard to pin down.
Absolutely. So uh, I want to have another question, and this has to go with your last podcast interview I saw with between you and Indestructible. If you're okay with talking about that, and
Yeah, yeah.
you had mentioned like during Gamergate, you felt I guess like cheated or slighted, that some of the people that you were close to had kind of I don't know how to say this, like turned their back or didn't agree with it with uh, I guess like the censorship that you had dealt with. How did you get through that tough time for you?
Uh, I didn't particularly well. What really got to me was the two things really. The sense of betrayal that I felt, um, and the fact that a lot of these people were people I'd known for years who should have known me better than to think I would take up with anything that was hateful, or harassment, and yet they were putting other viewpoints over and ahead of mine despite our personal relationship. And then, given my experience and a lot of our experience within, gaming and rock and metal music and goth and vampire subculture and everything else, we'd weathered a lot of moral panics before, and we'd always been a united front against them. And yet this time, they weren't on board. And this, from what I could see, was another new moral panic being prosecuted. And I don't think it's really stopped. I think it's spread beyond gaming. It's gotten into broader culture now. But yeah, I didn't cope particularly well. I felt very lost for a long time, and it ended up provoking a suicide attempt. I struggle with depression anyway. I've been diagnosed since 2007, but yeah, when something massively impactful like that happens, like people you think of as friends turning their back on you, um, it's not something you get through easily, especially if you already have a tendency to think badly.
Absolutely, and Jim, I do appreciate you sharing that, and that's something from my aspect. Do you think GamerGate is kind of what kicked off that idea of, I guess, censorship and this moral scare, as you put it, kind of spreading out as it is now?
I think the moral panic was kind of starting before then, um, and you still see a lot of it in this idea that games have to change or every game has to be for everybody. And people have become very risk averse. And obviously, as someone who likes horror and science fiction and playing with ideas, and who has pretensions to be artistic in his games, these things are worrying, and I've seen it before. And it seems to be everywhere. It's comics, films, TV, writing, even knitting has its culture wars now. There's no escape from it. But I guess Gamergate was when it first kind of peeked its head over the parapet, and when I realised that this time it was different.
Yeah, and I on a different but similar way, I do relate with that. When Gamergate happened on my neck of the woods, I was in the midst of college and studying, and I'm a nurse, and nursing school was very brutal. And it's like when I finished school and finally had a moment to kind of go back to my hobbies, it was a completely different landscape, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, and it's kind of like you can't escape anymore. There's You can't get away from all this all this nonsense. It follows you into your hobbies. Yeah, it follows you into all the things that you normally do to get away from that, to get out of your head and have a break for a while. The other thing I found very disturbing is like my whole life I've been politically on the left and quite radically on the left, and yet these days what I see in this moral panic, in this censorship, has primarily come from my own side, so to speak. That's changing now. There's more censorship coming from the opposition, I think. But that just compounded that sense of betrayal. It's like, we're not supposed to do this. This isn't us,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree with you, man. If you're okay with it, anyone in the audience, are you okay if they have a question, if they come up and ask you directly a question pertaining to role playing games or whatever it is that we're talking?
Yeah, or anything else. Yeah, I'm a pretty open book.
Okay, cool. So, guys in the audience, if you would like to request to speak, there's a microphone button at the bottom. Just hit that, and I'll get you guys up here, and you guys can join the stage and ask a question. There is a little bit of a delay between the speakers and the listeners, so you guys may be hearing this a few seconds after I say it, but I'll give you guys a moment to come on up. Going once. Going twice. Okay, if you guys change your mind, I'll be watching. Grim Jim, what are you currently any games you're currently playing, or I know you're active on YouTube. Anywhere else we can find you?
Yeah, if you go to post-mort.com, you'll find links to most of my stuff. My main YouTube channel is Postmortem Video, all one word. My streaming channel is Grim Streams. If you just search for that, you should be able to find it. I'm doing a project on Grim Streams at the moment where I'm trying to play every game in my bookshelf that I have not played. So we just played Starblazer Adventures, and next time we'll be playing Airship Pirates, which was the tie-in with the band Abney Park that Cubicle 7 did back around 2013, I think. I do normally run a game on Wednesday nights for a group of sex workers, so I put it that way, adult workers, called Tabletopless, but we're on hiatus at the moment. Um, I appear regularly on the T-Shirted Historians YouTube channel. He has a panel show on Saturday nights called The Week in Geek. So you could go and pop along there and give him a subscribe. Just finished a project called Penny Tower for the Red Room. Their Wretched RPG, which is a retro clone. So that's a setting book based on J.G. Ballard's works, mostly. And I'm writing an adult choose your own adventure book at the moment. That's my current project. Yeah, a lot of adult stuff. That's always been kind of a area of interest for me. I've always thought it odd that we focus so much on violence and so little on romance and sex and stuff.
You do bring up a good point. There's a lot of violence in these games. The last question I have for you, Jim, and this is going back to the interview that you had with Indestructible, because I know you said this multiple times where you've always been open to talk to whomever about whatever, but you were never able to get someone to come to the table, so to speak. They'd always back out at the last minute. How was that for you to actually finally get a chance to talk to somebody and just kind of just share opinions and more of a discussion rather than just a debate?
It was extremely welcome. I've been trying to foster that kind of communication for about 10 years at this point, and getting nowhere. So I was glad it went ahead, and I was surprised.
Yeah.
Greatly surprised that it went ahead, because I know Indestructible was put under pressure. Oh, you shouldn't talk to him, you shouldn't platform him, that kind of thing going on. People have the weirdest ideas about me. But yeah, I don't want to get too excited about it, but it's just nice to have had it happen. And, it's led to this and a couple of other things. So.
Yeah, and that's something that when I saw you guys' interview, I'm like, man, that's exactly what I'm hoping to be able to one day do with this show, is just get everybody, as many different people as I can, and just help remind people that we're all in this together. We're just trying to have fun. We may have different ideas about how we do that, but I don't think we have to tear each other down. I think there's somewhere.
We've always had our arguments, edition wars and things like that. But at the end of the day, we were all gamers together, and I think there's no need for a lot of the split that we have. You can be critical of people and you can disagree with them without making them into the devil. And I think a lot of these problems could be solved if people were just left alone to do their games the way they want.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Again, Grim Jim, I appreciate you so much for your time. That is all I had for today. I haven't seen anybody come up to ask a question. If you want to come up and speak with Grim Jim, feel free to do so. Just hit that request button. But again, this has been Table Space. My goal is to try to meet with as many people as I can, just talking about passions for the hobby. It looks like we do have Gnome Depot wants to come up here. Give me 1 second, sir. Bring you to the stage. All right. You feel free to ask away, my friend.
You played Vampire the Masquerade. Did you find that reading Anne Rice books really informed upon that? Or do you think Twilight has really taken away from that?
I think Twilight has taken away from it a bit. I mean, the original Vampire took its inspirations from anything and everything and threw them all together. And that was part of its charm, I think, was that you could do or be anything from any number of different vampire fictions in there. But I do think Anne Rice's work was obviously pretty influential on there. But past the first 2 or 3 of the Vampire Chronicles books, I think she kind of lost the plot as much as anyone else. But it did help to have those as kind of cultural touchstones for people to understand what was going on, certainly.
So, would you say that books have been more of the influence on the role playing community, at least in the past, as opposed to now? Like, say, Goblin Slayer right now is a big influence for me and informing upon my D&D campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, so books are easier to reference, I think. And with something like Goblin Slayer, you've also got a lot of visual reference. So it's a lot easier to thumb through a book and find a particular passage or description or something that you need than it is to, pause a film or find the right chapter to skip to on the DVD or whatever else. So, and I think it's less true than it used to be, but I do think that literature has had more of an influence on gaming. And I do think it helps you be a better games master if you do read a lot, if just to expand your vocabulary of adjectives to describe things.
And at this point in the role playing community, what would you find to be like the major influence are coming from? At this point, I'm worried about coming up with characters that will match up with Baldur's Gate.
Yeah, computer games have certainly been more of an influence since the edition that dare not speak its name, fourth. But I think tabletop role playing is its own beast, and it probably shouldn't try to replicate those things. But if someone comes to my table all enthusiastic, wanting to play a character that is like one from a computer game or a book or whatever, I'm not gonna mess with their fun. I'm gonna let them do that, and hopefully the character will develop and become more than that as we go along. Baldur's Gate's an interesting case because I think Baldur's Gate, to me, playing it, and I am playing it at the moment, it's very out of step with at least the online culture that Wizards has around them now. Like, it's challenging, it's deadly, it deals with topics that are difficult. It's got a lot of the trappings of modern D&D as well, a kind of soap opera drama and so on, but it also has a lot from what came before. So in some ways it's encouraging the success of Baldur's Gate, I think.
So you think it's like touching that third rail that we're not supposed to discuss in our role playing games?
Yeah, I think so.
So does it look hopeful, or do you think we're just going down a spiral?
For D&D or gaming in general?
Gaming in general.
I think we're going to see a split. I think there is a crash coming of some sort. I don't think the Kickstarter culture is sustainable in the long term, especially as we get more and more high profile failures that end up, with lots of people out of pocket and soured on the whole thing. I think they don't know what to do with 5th edition at Wizards. Do they keep it going, or do they change it to a new edition so they can make a lot of money? They're falling out with Critical Role to some degree or another. There's an extremely vocal online player segment for D&D that will never be happy, no matter what. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing overall if D&D falters, because it's when D&D has faltered that new and interesting things have happened. Like at the end of 2nd edition is when Storyteller took off. When 4th edition flopped, that's when Pathfinder came up, So hopefully we'll see something like that.
Because I remember that split happening when no one was playing D&D and everyone was playing vampire
Yeah.
in like every community, and it's like going, where am I going to find my players? I gotta learn this, you know.
Yeah. Well, and we've got the OSR now in its various forms. You know, there are continuity forms of different kinds of D&D, even fourth edition. You know, that you can move to if you fall out of step with mainline D&D. You know, there's a lot of creative options out there for people. The other thing I think might happen is that D&D will disappear up its own fundament as it shifts to its virtual tabletop, and they're probably going to end up moving all their sales and back catalogue and so on to their own site, so it won't be on, you know, Drive-Thru RPG or whatever. That seems inevitable. I just don't know how quickly they're going to move. So I think they're going to end up being their own thing. It'll be the D&D hobby in the same way that Warhammer is the Warhammer hobby, and then there'll be everybody else.
Getting to be more of the collectible hobby as opposed to being an actual gameplay wargaming thing.
Yeah.
Where you look forward to like taking all the stuff that you painted up and go over to your friend's house and beat each other up for the next 3.5 hours to 4 hours to 5 hours.
I think hobbyists everywhere are kind of aging up. We've got a lot more disposable income now, but we're short on time, so I think a lot of things are becoming collectors.
Because honestly, the people that in my family, I come from a lot of people in my family that play role-playing games. It's just that, I'm seeing the divide happening even in my own family, where my brothers are playing BattleTech online. Get that itch scratched, and
yeah,
and they're not getting it from D&D, and they're as much as I'd love to get them onto one of my online games. I know what scheduling is like for them because I know them intimately.
Yeah, I've got a meat space game with my very long running group this weekend, but we only manage to meet up every month and a half, and otherwise I'm playing online. And when you're playing online, people aren't quite so committed to the schedule. They feel like they can cancel or dip out much easier.
I mean, I much would rather have is to have a bunch of people sitting in front of me where I tell a story and they come up with the lines and I show them the scenery,
Yeah. I was an early adopter of the internet. I was on bulletin board systems, dialing in over a 2600 on my Atari ST computer. I mean, living deep in the sticks in England's countryside, using the internet as a way to socialize was never particularly stigmatized for me, because it was the only way I could meet people like me. The only goth in the village, so yeah.
I'm sorry, I was just thinking of like who does that comedy sketch in Britain about the
the only gay in the village, yeah.
I mean, no, I'm the only goth in the village.
That's awesome. Well, Noam, I do appreciate you coming up and asking. You have any more questions? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's good. I've done plenty.
Do you have any parting words for us?
This is where I'm supposed to say something wise or clever, isn't it?
Not necessarily.
Stay cynical, because a pessimist can only ever have a nice surprise.